what is blah blah? And I say, well, blah blah is just what forms the contrast with glue glue. So we understand that glue glue means not blah blah, and blah blah means not glue glue.
I think because if you're cool with that, Matt, British guy wanted to give Jack an opportunity to interact with you.
Sure.
Yeah, but I'm not really clear on what you guys are debating.
We started out with the euthyphro dilemma. So as a frame of reference, that's where we began the discussion.
So what is the response to that?
From my understanding, it looks like Matt is agreeing with an article that was created by William Lane Craig that is essentially summarized. I think, however, the euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma. It's a false dichotomy. There's a third alternative. It's not the case that God wills something because it is good, nor is it the case that something is good just because God wills it. Rather, God wills something because he is good. That is to say, it is God's own nature that determines what is the good. God is, by nature, essentially compassionate, justifying, just, fair, kind, loving, and so forth. And this started out when I was talking to another gentleman. I was essentially conceding the second horn of the euthyphro dilemma with the qualification that that is contingent upon God's own nature. I described it as on a semantic basis, essentially synonymous with saying that what is the good is arbitrary or uninformative from our position relative to God's own nature. And that was essentially the discussion, and I think that I agree with Matt in how he denied my description, reworded it, but I think we're on the same page. So that was essentially it.
Yeah, we are.
And Matt can correct me.
No, we're on the same page.
But I don't see how the euthyphro dilemma doesn't just reemerge at the level of God's nature.
It does.
So what horn do you take there?
We don't take a horn. We just say goodness is revealed out of God's character.
I don't understand how that's addressing the question.
What question?
Question of whether the God's nature is good in virtue of being God's nature, or in virtue of it conformity to an external standard of the good.
Neither. God reveals what's good out of his nature.
You know, it's not an epistemic issue, so I don't know what revelation has to do.
Just what it is. That's the Christian perspective. God reveals what is good out of his nature. That's it.
But I'm not asking for some like epistemic justification. I'm asking whether God's nature is good in virtue of being God's nature, or whether it's good in virtue of conforming to an external standard of the good. Saying that God reveals what is good isn't an answer to that.
God does not have anything external to him by which he is compared. So all that is good is based on his character. It's therefore self-revealed. That's the Christian perspective. To argue against that is, or to let's say avoid that, is to not argue the Christian perspective. To argue is to argue something else.
Well, that just sounds like you're taking the second horn.
No, we're saying that goodness is not based externally, nor is it arbitrary, but that God has a reason that relates to the absolute purity and essence of his nature. There is no universal good standard out there by which we can identify and say, oh, now we know that God is good. That would mean that goodness in that kind of a sense is greater than God. But there's nothing like that. From the Christian perspective, that doesn't exist. It's simply to even have the question, what is good, necessitates that God's character exists. He reveals what it is, and then we can discuss it.
So you're denying that something is good in virtue of being identical to God's nature.
I don't know what you mean by identical to.
Sorry?
Well, when you say identical to his nature, God alone has his own nature. Nothing else could be identical to it. in the sense of having another essence or ontological similarity. If you mean identical in the sense that it corresponds to his character, the revealed will, I'm trying to understand which one you mean.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by corresponds. I
Well, you
thought
and
that
I've
the
had,
claim, because Craig's view is that there's an identity between the between goodness and God's nature. He thinks there's an identity relation there.
okay, God simply, the biblical perspective is, only way we can know what is good is if God reveals it as an expression of his character, his essence, his nature. That's the Christian perspective.
Yeah, but I wasn't asking about knowledge.
Okay, what are you asking?
I'm asking whether you're denying that something is good in virtue of being identical to God's nature.
Denying it if it's identical to his nature? So I don't understand how it doesn't make sense. Denying something's good if it's identical to his nature. That doesn't make sense to me.
So look, the dilemma is that um, either God's nature is good in virtue of being God's nature, or it's good in virtue of conformity to an external standard of the good. It just sounds like um, I'm just not clear on which horn you're taking.
I don't think I'm taking either one.
If I may maybe assist, and maybe I won't be very helpful, it does sound like my understanding, Matt, of your position is that it does sound like you say, for example, the good is in virtue of it conforming to God's nature because God's nature is good, right? So that it's like a statement of identity. You're just saying, is it good walking a grandma across the street? Yes, because that conforms to God's nature. God is benevolent, right? So that would sound like that would be the second horn.
Okay, I'm confused then because you're talking about the euthyphro dilemma, right?
Yes.
And the euthyphro dilemma, the two horns are one that there's a standard of goodness outside of God, right? That's one.
Mm-hmm.
And the other horn is that God is arbitrary in his declaration of what is good. He just decides it, not that it is inherently good.
Yes, so I think that the second horn, for example, this is where I would disagree with Jack and Isaac on the nature of arbitrariness, as if God is determining what is good, as if it was not determined previously. If we just say that there's no determination being made, it's just an ongoing consistency of conformity between God and his creation, whatever conforms to his nature, which always was, then it's good. It sounds like that can fit within the second horn if you kind of if you're not redefining the second horn, but you're understanding it in the sense that the second horn is it's not an arbitrary determination. It just is what it is because God is all that exists and God is good. So from their perspective, they would say that that's an arbitrary determination, or anything that God says is an arbitrary determination, but we just wouldn't concede to those descriptions of God's nature.
Right. That's exactly correct. God is not arbitrary because they're assigning a non-Christian value to the Christian God in the idea of arbitrariness, as if there is no natural reason. It's hard to describe, but the character of God is such that he is all before the universe existed. He is the only thing that existed, and whatever is that exists, which is just him, is itself what it is. I mean, it is so tautologous. But since God reveals that he's holy and pure and right, then in that expression, we then recognize this brand new concept called good. But the goodness is not arbitrary because it's not external to God's nature. Excuse me, not arbitrary and internal to his nature, in that he has to decide at some point if something is or is not good. Because God has eternal knowledge, there would be no decision about what would be or would not be good. That knowledge is simultaneously eternal with his character, and he's simply expressing and would know his own expression of his own thoughts, what he is, and that expression which is not expressed because there's no creation yet, is the nature of what good is. When creation comes into actuality, then he reveals his character to us. This becomes what we understand to be good. What I see the atheist doing is saying, well, God's arbitrary in himself. And maybe I'm misunderstanding them, but I understand them to say God's arbitrary in himself in that there is no necessity of consistency in himself. He just decides what is or is not. No, that's not the Christian perspective. For one thing, he wouldn't decide because all knowledge is eternal, consistent with his nature. There's no decision or arbitrariness that's even possible in a Christian perspective. And furthermore, it would not be that there would be anything external to which you would have to bow and say, well, that over there is good. That's how I know what God is, which is the other horn of the dilemma. I see both of them as simply not representing the Christian perspective. I hope I'm clear.
Jack.
So it's just still not clear then. Is Matt taking the second horn?
Okay, so my opinion is that he's taking the second horn with qualification of God's nature, right? So one of the implications of taking the second horn is that an atheist would want to say, oh, well, God is God's nature because it's a moral tautology, is arbitrary such that then God can determine to lie, because what is good is based upon his nature, and his nature is non-informative, nor is it intelligible, and therefore he can just then lie. We would, of course, deny that, right? So Hebrews 6 says that God cannot lie. So that would be the implication. I think that would be the dividing line between the atheist and Matt's position of what Matt's describing about God's nature. And I hope that that's a helpful summary.
And I think that what they're doing is abandoning the Christian perspective. When they're arguing about the Christian God, they didn't deny him. God, as you said, cannot lie. And, Titus 1:2 says so, because lying is an inconsistency with his nature. He just can't. So there is no arbitrary with God, arbitrariness, I should say. Maybe the word arbitrary is the stumbling stone here. I don't know.
We believe that it's purposed and intention, Jack. So like what Matt so the difference between me and Matt is that I would be fine with conceding that it's arbitrary because it's based on the issue that God cannot appeal to external reasons or external rationalities for his standard. Otherwise, he would not be the standard. I would also agree with Matt in the sense that I would say that it's purposeful and intentioned in his own nature. But the way that we work to say that reason or rationality has any or carries any meaning is that we are appealing to external reasons. We're appealing to reasons that are not do not lie solely within the self, because if they do, and you don't have reasons for what you choose, well, at that point you might as well call yourself arbitrary. You're just picking one thing over the other without reason. But that's an internal condition, and what Matt would defend is that it's internal and it does not appeal externally for reasons, but that is purposeful. And I would agree with that. I think it's basically that point. I think it's a semantic primitive to say that God is purposefully good, right? Because it's internally it's like an internal infinite regress within God's
Hey, Jesse,
nature.
I hate to interrupt, but Brad Kittle just wants to say hello.
Hey, Jesse, how you doing? I just was asking him if you were still out there.
Oh, hi, how you
Hey,
doing?
good. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Sorry, I was listening. Go ahead.
Does that make sense, Jack and Matt? Is that perhaps maybe kind of bridge the gap a little bit in the way that we're talking about this? Maybe.
Sir. I think the problem is in what we call arbitrary. Because what I understand, I thought I was going to jump in, but what I understand arbitrary to be is by chance or no reason. It could be this one time, and the exact same situation might choose something else for no reason. It's just arbitrary. But there is no arbitrariness with God.
I think maybe Dog has suggested a way to clarify the issue, which is, does God not lie because lying is wrong or bad or evil? Or when we say that lying is bad or wrong or evil? Is it simply because God doesn't do it?
Neither. I would say neither. It is true that he can't, but I want to add, I don't know how to add this, how to say it right. Um, he doesn't lie because it's wrong, or he just doesn't because he doesn't choose to, but because it's inconsistent with his nature. He cannot violate his own nature. Whatever quality God has, he does not possess its opposite. If he's true, he can't possess non-truth. And so therefore, if he's true and he's consistent with himself, he cannot lie. It's not possible with God. I don't know if I'm on the right track with you guys, but that's what I'm trying to get to. It's just not possible with God to lie, because that's what he is. And he reveals all his character as good. That's the only way we can have any real discussion about what good is, if we have a standard by which we can even ask the questions. And the only way to do that is assume the Christian God.
Well, it doesn't seem to really be clearing things up. So it's not the case then that God ever does anything because it's good. Is that the idea?
No, I think what the problem here is he doesn't do anything because it's good, as if good is some quality that he has to adhere to. That's the condition I'm having a problem with.
And as a moderator
Because
note, real quick, I just wanted to remind everybody that Chris's room on prayer is going to occur in 10 minutes. And since Matt, you're leading this discussion, I would just let you probably decide whether you want to move over there or you want to stay here, because all the Christians in the room, they're going to stay here if this discussion continues, but they'll probably go to the other room for prayer if you decide that's better.
Yeah, what do you
uh,
think we should do? I mean, I'm gonna go there regardless, Jesse, but I don't know whether we should close the room and invite everyone here, or I don't know what to do. Because Christopher did say that atheists were welcome to listen.
Well, that's
What have I
why I'm
missed,
leaving it
everyone?
up to Matt, because Matt, if you're leading this discussion, like the Christians in the room, they're going to go pray if you follow. But if you in your discernment, if this is a more important endeavor, we can postpone a prayer room. You know what I'm saying? So
What
I'm
have
just leaving
I
it up
what
to
have
you,
I
Matt.
missed?
I'm not sure.
It's just a
uh,
discussion, Matt.
yeah, we're just having a discussion. It's a polite one, but uh, I want to stay here and talk about it a little bit more, because I think I'm at the heart of something with them. Um, but I think prayer is far more important because it's prayer. So kind of, an impasse. We have two horns here. Let me just say this really fast. And what ANGSTREICH was saying, I think we're close, but I'm trying to say something. I'm not sure if I know how to word it right. It's not the case that God does good, as if goodness is something God ought to do, or goodness is something that God just does. Instead, whatever God does is by definition good. I don't know if that makes any sense. I don't think it clears anything up, but that's what I'm trying to say.
The question we were addressing the other day in Hades' room was essentially then, and I think that this is helpful to say that whatever God does is good, right? And whatever God does is based on his nature, therefore it's good. The question then could be wrapped back around to asking whether or not God then could engage in an action of taking a family into a car and burning them alive in the car, and by the nature of reality of us being dependent upon God, morally dependent upon God, we would then perceive such actions as being good.
Yeah, we're kind of have a catch-22 here, because we want to say that we know what good is in order to judge God's goodness, but God is one who reveals good. Well, yet we're saying he reveals it, but we know what it is also, almost as if we're saying we know what goodness is apart from God, but that's not the case. So this is difficult to articulate, but it's not the case that God does good as if goodness is something that God ought to do. Instead, whatever God does is good because that's what he does, and whatever he does is revealing what is good, and only then can we even begin to discuss what is good. So if we're going to discuss what is good and apply it to God, where's our starting point? I'm saying you have to start with God. And someone else says, begging the question. Yeah, that's right. Of course we have to beg the question. Everybody does. Which worldview justifies it? In our worldview, we'd say that's the only way we can even know what good is. We got to start with God's character.
Well, what I'm trying to understand is, so take lying. So presumably lying is something that's bad, right? And you want to say there's an inconsistency between God and lying, right? It's inconsistent with his character. But you're saying it's not inconsistent with his character because it's bad, right? It's not because lying is bad that God can't do it, which is to say, God, being a perfectly good being, can't do a bad thing, right? So it's not because lying is bad that God is incapable of doing it, right? So it sounds like you're saying that it's bad to lie because God can't do it.
Do you repeat the last sentence?
Sounds like you're saying that it's bad to lie because God can't.
Yeah, in that narrow sense, yeah.
But I guess I'm not sure I understand how there's any normativity there.
But I know what you mean by normativity.
Where the ought comes from.
That's something I've never heard anybody, myself included, or any Christian theologian, be able to connect the logical dots with. If we say, for example, that God is the big king of the universe, whatever he says goes, are we then able to connect the dots of why it is true that whatever he says goes? And that's a problem. I think here, when we get to the Christian perspective, I think what we're going to have to say is that um, we ought to do things. This is where language is insufficient. We ought to do things because God said so. Well, is what he says so right? Yes. Why? Because he's God. Well, how do we know he's right? Because he's God. And we get into this vicious circle. It all comes back to the nature and essence of who God is. The Christian perspective is that God reveals his character, and his character is such that he cannot lie, he cannot bear false witness, he cannot be inconsistent with his own nature. So that's why some people think that the law of identity is the primary law of logic, which is reflecting the character of God, because without that, you don't have any internal consistency. And out of all the internal consistency of his truth comes the moral statements that are connected with those moral. With those internal consistencies, since God is also moral. Therefore, in the Christian perspective, the idea is that moral consistency is part and parcel interwoven with the very nature of his truth essence, and what is revealed as a truth statement also has moral value because it's related to God's character, which is morally good. And the only reason we know that is because it reveals it as such. So this becomes tautologous, circular, but it's the only way to answer it.
Well, it just seems like the claim that God is good just is the claim that God is godly.
Yes, there you go. That's Christian thought. God is the terminus. There's nothing beyond him. When I talk with atheists about this, I say God is a terminus in that there's nothing beyond him that we can go. We can't go any further. And from what I understand, not trying to be disrespectful to atheists, but when I discuss things with atheists, they don't have a terminus. They have an infinite regression of how do you know this, how do you know that. I'm not saying it in a mocking sense, but in Christianity, God is the terminus as a self-revealed being. And that's it. We don't go beyond him. We can't subject him to our logic or our rules or our moral propensities. He reveals all that it is, and the very issue of logic, truth, morality all take their basis and support and initiation in the character and mind of God. And that's just Christian perspective.
Well, to say God is godly we agree then that's really not to say anything more than something like God behaves the way that he behaves.
Yes.
But isn't that going to be true of everything?
Yes.
Everything behaves the way that it behaves?
Yes, but it's a point of relative distinction. From our position, we see both good and evil, and we're making the distinction that God is one over the other from our epistemic position.
Right. We do that, but what we do when we do that is sometimes arbitrary and is very often incorrect. This is why the only way we can discuss what is good is if we have a terminus, a proper standard. God has to be that standard. The Christian perspective is that there's nothing against which God may be compared, nothing against, which means even our logical machinations and descriptions of trying to um, understand him or justify things in him ultimately is not Christian to do.
Well, I'm just trying to understand why it would be an interesting thing to say that anything acts the way that it acts.
Well, that's just what it is. God acts the way he acts. You would agree with that. Anything that has existence, has an ontos, also has uh, properties that relate to that ontos. God is no different. And the reason we know that things that have properties relate to the ontos is because God has that ontos and has properties. And so anything that exists that's created by God reflects his character. He then is the terminus, even in that logical truth.
Yeah, but see, I think that what is under discussion is a concept of the good that's not analytically identical to godliness, right?
I don't see how we can, as a Christian, from a Christian perspective, trying to remember what you said. Okay, I'm sorry. I lost a statement you said. I was trying to write it down, but I was thinking out loud and I messed myself up. Could you say that again?
Yeah, I was saying what's under discussion is a concept of the good that's not analytically identical to godliness.
Is not analytically identical to godliness. Analytically, when you say analytically identical, what do you mean by that? If I can
There's
ask.
a distinction between an analytic identity and a synthetic identity. So, an analytic identity is something true in virtue of the meanings of the words alone. So, if you say a bachelor is a married man, that's true just because the word bachelor means married man, right? That's going to be contrasted with what are called synthetic identities, which are going to be identities that hold not in virtue of meanings, um, uh, but in virtue of what might be called worldly facts. So, a standard example would be that Superman is Clark Kent, right? So the name Superman does not mean the same thing as the name Clark Kent, but nonetheless, Superman is Clark Kent, right? That's true not in virtue of the meaning of the names Clark Kent and Superman, but in virtue of a fact about who Superman is and who Clark Kent is, namely the same person, right? Um, so, um, so when I say the concept of the good under discussion is not one which is analytically identical to godliness, right? What Craig is saying is it's true that goodness is godliness, but that's not an analytic truth. It's a synthetic truth. So it's not that the word good means godly. It's just that what the good picks out, what its referent is, happens to be um, that which is in conformity with God's nature, something like that. That's the
Sure, I understand everything, but you said analytic is I'm not arguing with you, I'm just trying to repeat. Concept that goodness is not analytically identical to God. Analytical identity is true by definition. The bachelor is not married. Synthetic identity identifies hold not in virtue of meaning, but in worldly facts. Superman is Clark Kent. The name is not the same thing as him. Yeah, I would agree, uh, but I'm trying to understand because I conclude that the distinctions of identities necessitates an absolute true foundation, which can only be held in God to begin with. What I've noticed, maybe I'm not on the same track here with you, but as I hear things, and I hear other atheists talk about things like this, and they try and use philosophical. I'm not trying to say bloviation. I'm not. That's not my intention. But they go into philosophical thought and ideas. What they're doing is presupposing certain natural laws of logic by which they even begin to have a discussion. They're trying to be logical. They're trying to be accurate, and I grant that they're trying to do that, but they're ultimately begging the question. They're assuming certain things to be true that they're beginning to. They begin conversations by assuming certain values to be true, name their definitions. And they say, well, we have a definition of what might be called analytical identity or synthetic identity, or whatever it might be, or an epistemological basis for justification, true justified belief. And they have these things that they assume as our proper starting points by which they can then get into a conversation. One of the things I like to do is say, what justifies those assumptions to begin with? In the Christian worldview, we assume that God's nature is what it is, naturally, and that he will reveal himself out of his nature, and whatever he reveals of his nature, and we can say by verbs, like don't lie. Well, we understand that propositional statements or statements of truth fact reflect his character as well as intellectual, as well as spiritual, as well as emotional, as well as moral, because they're all tied up with the character of God, because he is all of those things, not comprised in parts, but as one would call divine simplicity, that all those aspects of God belong to the one thing that is God. So when he speaks, for example, thou shalt not lie, he's saying all of those things, or all those things are behind the statement. His character, his essence, his eternality, his absoluteness, his moral quality, and everything. And they become revealed to us in a statement. And so when I hear, and we understand then, and only then with that revelation, then only then we even say, well, what is good? And to ask the question, what is good, and then ask questions about what is good, and questions about questions about questions, but to even ask the question, what is good, is to say there is a terminus that reveals the nature of goodness, and we're discussing it. But in order to do that, you have to presuppose certain laws of logic and certain principles. But how do you do that unless you presuppose God to begin with from that perspective? So when I'm thinking of all these things, this is all that's in my head. I'm going, why are the atheists, and this is, I'm wondering out loud, why do they beg the question by assuming certain uh, linguistic structures, question statements, definitions are true to begin with, to even ask the question about God? I think they're missing the mark. I think they don't realize that they can't even ask the question without ultimately presupposing the Christian God. And that by questioning the Christian God, by asking the questions, they're ultimately self refuting. Because if they're going to ask what good is, as an example, then how do they know what good is to even ask the question? Because everything then without God would be arbitrary to them. But we're not saying that God is arbitrary and that goodness is arbitrary, because if they're going to say that things might be arbitrary based on what they think God might be, that's not what the Christian God is, and they're no longer arguing the Christian God. But if they argue from the Christian God, then I don't understand how they could even ask the right questions without presupposing the Christian God. Does this make sense? Am I just too convoluted here?
Well, I'm not sure it's really tracking the issue that the euthyphro dilemma is trying to raise, right? I think maybe one way to think about it is you could meaningfully ask the question, is it good to be godly, right? Which shows that if there's an identity between the good and the godly, it's not an analytic identity, but a synthetic identity, right? In which case, the reason why it's good to be godly is because the good consists in the godly, right? In the same way that Clark Kent is Superman, water is H2O, and so forth, right? Those types of synthetic, morning star is the evening star, right? Those synthetic identities. Then when you ask why is it good to be godly, it's just because they're the same thing, right? Whereas on the view that there's an analytic identity between the two, it just seems like you're talking about something else, right? Because people are trying to understand why they ought to be in conformity with God's nature, right? Which is, so in other words, if you take it analytic that you ought to take it as analytic that you ought to do what is good, right? You ought to be good, right? Um, People are going to want to understand why ought they be in conformity with God's nature, and then you can say because God's nature is good, right? That's why we ought to be in conformity with God's nature. But if you're just taking good to be godly, it sounds like you're just equivocating on the term good there. If you're taking it to mean godly, is what I mean. If you say good just means godly, right? Then if we say, why ought I to be godly? We don't have an answer to that question, right? Because when you say God is good, you're just saying God is godly. And somebody can just ask, well, why ought I to be godly? I think that's sort of the issue that is the euthyphro dilemma is trying to raise.
Well, you ask, is it good to be godly? Say, yeah, it's good to be godly if it's behaving in a manner consistent with God's nature. But then that's what it means to be good and be godly. So people will then say, well, then you're not getting anywhere. And I say, well, yeah, we are. Because if you're going to say it's good to be godly, then what is goodness? Is goodness something that we identify apart from God's godliness character? Well, that would not be the Christian perspective. Good is what God reveals. And so it's good to be consistent with God and his purity. Well, why is that the case? Because God says so. We can't justify it because if we do, we're bringing God down to our level and applying logic to him and having him be subject to our logic, which that's not the Christian perspective. It's good to be godly because that is what goodness is. It's conformity with God's nature. But to ask why we ought to be in conformity with God's nature is to subject God's nature to our understanding of God's nature. I just don't think we're going to get anywhere at this place, at this rate. So goodness, furthermore, is only known through God's self-revelation. To even ask, is it good to be godly, necessitates that we have God reveal what goodness is, which is consistent with his character. Then to say, is it good to be consistent with his character? Well, they were saying there must be a standard of goodness that we can apply to God about his character. And that doesn't work either. We simply say, as Christians, God reveals what goodness is. It's consistent with his character, and we ought to be consistent with his character. Why? Because he says so. Now, that may not be very satisfying. It's because he said so is, I can unpack it, but I'm just going to stop there for now. Just say, well, that's just what he says, because it's consistent with his nature, because he's the standard of goodness. Well, why is that the right standard? We can't keep going infinitely here. There has to be a terminus. Otherwise, we have no way of knowing anything. And even the questioning about it becomes ultimately meaningless. So, in a Christian perspective, God is a terminus in that we don't ask anything beyond him because we're not capable of knowing anything beyond him unless he reveals it. Therefore, he's the terminus.
Look, you made a couple of claims that were very outlandish when Abdul was here. Number one, you were confusing Alethetic subjectivism with subjectivism about moral truths. If I say to you that all moral truths are subjective, that's going to be a metaethical claim. That's not going to be a claim about me saying, well, you ought to believe that moral subjectivism is true, or that all moral, or sorry, that all truth is subjective. You conflated that. And then you said another ridiculous claim that somehow Christianity gets out of the Izotz distinction. So I just want you to tell me, we can grant that Christianity is true. We could grant uh, all of that stuff, right? But how does that entail anything as to what we ought or ought not do?
I was still focusing on the first part of what you said, trying to get through that. And so I didn't get the second part. So you said for me to say that all moral truths, when someone says all morality is subjective,
That's a
uh,
meta-ethical claim. That's not a claim about. That's not anything close to alethic subjectivism.
so let me ask you, do you agree or disagree that statements are true or false?
Uh, sure, but I don't. I mean, I take it. I do agree that moral claims are propositional, right? They're truth apt, but all of them are false. There are no true moral propositions.
I asked, are statements either true or false?
Yes.
So which is it?
Yeah, but sure, like moral claims can be true or false, but they're all false.
Okay, so um, so you agree that statements either have a truth value or a false value, right? There's no in
Yes,
between.
yes, I agree.
Okay, okay. So here is a statement true or false? It is always wrong for everyone to torture babies to death merely for their personal pleasure.
That's a false statement.
So then you're advocating that there are times that it's morally good to torture
No,
babies to death
that
merely
doesn't
for your personal
follow.
pleasure.
No, that doesn't
Well, if
follow.
it's
The fact that I believe that the statement is false doesn't entail anything about my advocacy for it.
you believe the statement is false, which means you believe that it's not always wrong to torture babies to death, which means the corollary is that there are
Right.
times when it's morally correct.
Yeah,
So
that moral proposition is false.
can you give me a situation that falsifies the statement?
Well,
All it,
I take it that if you think that there are moral truths, you're going to be committed to some sort of um, moral property of goodness or wrongness out there in the world, right? Which is either going to be known analytically or else by definition, or it's going to be known synthetically, right? There's some causal explanation that is empirically known for that property. But since neither a moral property can be synthetically known or analytically derived, right, there's no reason to believe that such moral norms exist. So then when you predicate that something is wrong, you're just invoking a false statement. You're not invoking a statement that corresponds to reality.
wow, wow. I guess you know the nature of reality and how statements correspond to it. That's interesting.
Okay.
But I asked
Okay.
you,
So can you
I
respond to what I was saying about
no, I
all
can't.
moral propositions being false?
No, I can't because I
Why
couldn't follow
not?
what you were saying.
I thought you had the necessary precondition for intelligibility. I thought that
If
your
you,
worldview was the
if
only
you,
intelligible one. So why don't you
if you,
respond to my claim
Wait,
if
wait, wait, wait.
first,
Keep it orderly,
and
Darth.
then
Ask him a question, let him respond.
I was going to say, if you'd not interrupt and let me answer you, that would probably be a better thing to do, Darth. Okay. I said, I was going to say, the reason I can't respond is because you gave so much information with so much new terminology that I don't understand all of the terms and how you're using them. So I can't respond to it. That's all I was saying. But you interrupted. Now, what I was asking you before was simply this. Is our statements true or false? You said that's true. I gave a statement. It is
statements
always
can
wrong for.
be true or false. Yeah, truth apt.
So I gave the statement. It is always wrong for anyone to torture babies to death merely for their personal pleasure. You said the statement is false. So now I'm asking you to demonstrate its falsity.
I did.
Falsify it.
Did you just did I not give an explanation to you as to why all moral propositions are false?
No, I want you to show me the falsification of the statement. That the statement is false, that it's always wrong for anyone to torture babies to death. That means it's false, which means there's a condition in which it is right for someone to torture babies to death. And that's what you're advocating, the opposite. So I'm asking you to demonstrate the truth value of that claim that you're making.
Okay, if it's the case that the proposition torturing babies is wrong, uh, is true, then there is some property out there in the world which invokes goodness. It is not the case that there is such property in the world that invokes goodness. Therefore, it's not the case that that proposition, torturing babies for fun, is true.
Yeah, you beg the question when you say there's a property of goodness out there. Without defining that, you just assume it. So you're not saying anything. I've asked you to give me a situation or a statement
I just
that
gave.
validates.
I just
You're
gave.
interrupting again.
I'm sorry.
You keep interrupting.
Well, and you're not listening.
I am listening. You said that there was the case, or not the case, of the property of goodness out there to which the statement applies. Something to that effect. I was trying to write it down. The thing is, I asked you a specific question. You're not answering the specific question.
No, I
You
already
stated that
answered it. If
that
you can't listen, that's
you
your problem. Okay.
you you
I just
stated that
want
the
confirmation from the room. Did I not give this guy an argument as to why that proposition was false?
appeal to ad populum.
No,
Look,
that's not. I'm not
can I
making an argument
can you
of populum. I'm just
can you
asking a question.
can you answer my question?
Yeah.
Since you say it is false, that it's always wrong for everyone to torture babies to death merely for personal pleasure. You're saying it's false. It's not the case that is true. You're saying it has no truth bearing. That means then that there are situations when it's morally proper to torture babies to death merely for their personal pleasure. Is that your position?
No, my advocacy of that is irrelevant. I just believe that the proposition is false.
Okay, so yeah, the proposition is false.
Right.
So is the content value of the proposition true or not true?
The content value of the proposition, it's false. The statement doesn't
So then
correspond to reality.
it does not correspond to reality. Your statement doesn't correspond to reality.
No, the statement torturing babies is wrong. That statement doesn't correspond to reality. Therefore, it's not.
What do you mean it doesn't correspond to reality?
That presumably, when someone is predicating that something is wrong, they have an idea that there is such a moral property in the world that's either going to be analytically derived, right? It's going to be true by definition, or there's some causal explanation, right? That explains why that property exists in the first place. But what I'm arguing is that you can't derive the existence of such moral properties analytically. They're not true by definition. They aren't like some axiom of logic. And neither is it the case that those propositions, or sorry, that those properties of goodness and wrongness are going to be known empirically, right? Because they aren't physical objects, right? No one experiences moral properties a posteriori, right? So the question is, what when the realist says that something is wrong and they invoke a moral ontology, if there's no such thing as a moral ontology, then we could just dismiss all their claims as false.
You know, you beg the question. You assume your positions to
No,
begin.
how is that begging the question?
Can can I finish?
I'm just saying, in
Can I
virtue of
finish?
the fact that there is no
Wow.
moral ontology, your position is false.
Okay, it's hard to have a conversation with you when you constantly interrupt. I let you speak, I listen, I begin to speak,
Well,
and then
you
you
aren't
step on
dealing
my
with
words.
the argument.
So I don't agree with what you're saying. I let you finish.
Okay, so what?
I guess I guess then that you don't want to have a good conversation because you keep interrupting. I'm just assuming that's the case. Is that true?
No, I want to have a conversation.
Then why are you interrupting me when I continue to ask you not to do that so that I can complete my thoughts?
Okay, complete your thought, please.
I asked you why.
I just
Why do
gave,
you keep doing
I
it?
just gave an argument. I'm not going to repeat myself. Now, I want you to answer the question that I gave you previously. Let's assume that Christianity is true. Let's assume that the Bible is inerrant. Let's assume all those things. How does that entail anything, right, as to what I ought or ought not to do? How do you establish that there are categorical norms, or there are things that I ought to do independent of my beliefs and desires? How do you establish that?
God said so.
Yeah, that's a descriptive claim. I'm asking you would what would deduce from that logically that there's a normative claim, or is there's
You
a normative fact of the matter as to what I ought to do? Just saying God says so is irrelevant. That's a descriptive claim.
contradict yourself. You said assume that the values of Christianity are true.
I
The
didn't
reason,
contradict
can I
myself.
finish?
I didn't
Can I,
contradict
can I finish?
myself.
If you interrupt me one more time, I'm going to stop talking to you.
Why are we letting
Yeah,
this guy
look,
bloviate? Right?
because here's the issue. Any of us and any other day can deal with any of these conversations on our own, what have you. British guy wants good conversation between Matt, you guys, and vice versa. If I can help translate, I'll do that. It doesn't have to be a one-way conversation. But for example, Jack was interacting with Matt. Darth, you're interacting with Matt. If you guys don't want to interact with Matt, then go create another room where you guys interact with other Christians. But right now, Matt is representing the Christian position. So that's why he is dominating the conversation, is because the other Christians in the room are letting him have the conversation.
And I'm just simply asking that he be polite and let me finish my sentences without constantly interrupting.
So if I understand this, Darth, you're just basically saying there is no moral ontology. So if there's no moral ontology, then we can just dismiss all the claims outright.
Yeah, that would be one aspect. There's going to be other aspects like, um, you know, the fact that no categorical norms have been established, the fact that he keeps appealing to Christianity being true, and that there's a fact of the matter as to what we ought or ought not to do. But he keeps making descriptive claims, and he thinks that those descriptive claims logically entail normative claims, but that's false because you can't logically deduce a normative claim from a
Yeah, but you need to hit on one point at a time. So
yeah,
for
so
example,
I just want the
categorical.
latter, basically, is what I'm hitting on. He hasn't established categoricity.
Yeah, so do you want to elaborate on that? Maybe give him a little bit more to work with, me and myself as well, because I'm not entirely, I don't know that I or maybe the majority of the other people in the room know what you mean by categorical norms.
There are going to be the type of moral norms that are going to be independent of our beliefs and desires. So they aren't going to be instrumental norms, right? So
How do we see that practically?
is there a fact of the matter as to what we should or shouldn't do that isn't dependent on any agents whatsoever? On any on any agent relative standards, I should say.
Can I jump back in and get back to what I wanted to say before I was
Sure.
yet again rudely interrupted? Darth, you said if we grant the truth of the Christian perspective, well, if you do that, then you're obligated under that grant to obey God because he's revealed that that's what we ought to do. If you say, I'll grant you the Christian perspective, then I tell you what the Christian perspective is, and then you argue and say it's not a true perspective, then why are you granting
No, no,
it?
no, 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 no. I've already granted the Christian perspective for the sake of argument. I'm just saying, how does the fact that God reveals himself to me motivate any agent whatsoever as to what we should or shouldn't do? You haven't established that. You kept saying that we're obligated in virtue of the fact that God revealed it to me, but that's just begging the question against what I'm saying. I'm arguing against categoricity, right?
To motivate is
So
subjective. So what motivates one
give,
person may not motivate another. So I don't see your
give
statement as
me
being.
give me an argument
Okay,
that
I'm done. I keep trying
Yeah.
to
two
talk. You
Hey,
keep
Darth.
interrupting.
Darth,
Okay,
literally,
shut
we're
you've
up,
done.
been,
John.
whether you
Shut up,
realize it or not, you've
shut
been
up, John.
interrupting Matt
Shut up,
continually,
John. Shut up,
and
John.
you're interrupting me even as well.
Yeah, sorry, guys. Look, I understand you guys don't like John, okay? But if you're gonna just do that, well, then what are we gonna do? You guys got to go down to the audience if you're gonna.